Hello everyone, I'm DST Studios, and I am a nerd. And like many nerds, I had a lot of different interests in my younger years. Marine biology, geophysics, particle physics, before I finally settled on paleontology. I was intent on becoming a paleontologist. I had all of the Jurassic Park movies on VHS. I would spend days looking through books on dinosaurs, and I could tell you the scientific names of a ridiculous amount of them. If you were to take a look at that kid, you would not be remiss in thinking that he would go on to work in that field. But it was around this time I got sent to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center to participate in their Space Academy program. I was pretty apathetic to spaceflight at the time. Sure, it was cool, but I thought it wasn't for me. But the more and more I learned, the more my fascination grew, and by the end of that trip, paleontology was a distant memory. I became obsessed with this new world. I started learning everything there was to learn about spaceflight. I would read Wikipedia articles on the Saturn V, I would watch Scott Manley videos on spaceflight, and play hours and hours of KSP. But unfortunately, when you live in a small town in the American Midwest, there aren't many people who are interested in spaceflight who live near you. So I made the unfortunate mistake of trying to find a community of like-minded folks online, more specifically the cesspool we call Reddit. I had no idea what I was about to see. I started seeing a lot of posts about SpaceX, an unproportional amount, but I shrugged it off. Then I started seeing something that confused me. Commenters on many of these subreddits would just hate on aspects of the spaceflight industry. But there was one component hated by these commenters the most, NASA's newest moon rocket, the Space Launch System, better known as SLS. SLS would receive massive amounts of hate in the comments, while these commenters would always have a convenient solution. Cancel SLS and give the money to SpaceX to build their BFR rocket, because Elon Musk would handle the money better, and that by his leadership he would single-handedly bring us to Mars and save our species. I was confused. Sure, BFR was an interesting concept, but I could never see what all the hype was about, or more importantly, what all the hate was about. And so young me sat at the computer wondering, how did we get here? So we start off in the year 2004. NASA had just reinstated the shuttle to operational status after the Columbia disaster, and it was now apparent to everyone that the shuttle had to go. 14 people were dead, the flaws in its design were apparent, and while we had built amazing pieces of space infrastructure like the ISS, many people felt as if we'd been stuck in low Earth orbit for much too long. So in January 2004, the Constellation program was established. It was composed of 2 launch vehicles that were shuttle-derived. Now, what is a shuttle-derived vehicle? Basically, NASA needs to make a new launch vehicle, and they have 2 options. A. Create a completely new system requiring you to change all of your infrastructure and existing tooling, or B. Use the same hardware to create a new launch vehicle with identical or similar components. The cheaper and less complex choice is to do option B. And since the existing tooling was used for the shuttle, that's why we get the name shuttle-derived vehicle. The 2 rockets that were to be built was the Ares 1 and the Ares 5. The Ares 1 consisted of an extended shuttle SRB first stage with a Hydrolox upper stage that was going to take the Orion command module to low Earth orbit. Then there was the Ares 5, a massive heavy lift launcher that was to outscale the Saturn V in payload capacity. This, in theory, was a good idea, because you didn't have to make one launch vehicle that could do everything. Unlike the shuttle, you could make each launcher specialized at a specific task, Ares 1 for crew and Ares 5 for payload. Constellation had big plans. It was of course going to be able to put people on the ISS, but it would also bring America back to the moon and was designed to be able to land humans on Mars. Unfortunately, the first blow to Constellation was that it was never properly funded. This will become a running theme. Funding 2 new launch vehicles, while a smart idea in theory, is not cheap. But that was only the first thing in a line of bad events. After President Obama was elected, he was rather hesitant about going to the moon. As his press secretary stated, This isn't a step backwards. I think the step backwards was trying to recreate the moon landings of 40 years ago using largely yesterday's technology, instead of game-changing new technology that can take us further, faster, and more affordably into space. Now, in my opinion, this statement is frustratingly ignorant, and it deservedly gained a lot of criticism from members of Congress. Congress cannot and will not sit back and watch the reckless abandonment of sound principles, a proven track record, a steady path to success, and the destruction of our human spaceflight program. This negative opinion of lunar exploration held by the Obama administration did not help the program, along with Congress's unwillingness to fund the program. And then it got even worse with the 2008 recession. So the Obama administration did what any political administration wanting to offload a problem would do. They outsourced their responsibility. More specifically, they decided to privatize a part of the space industry, along with canceling nearly the entirety of the Constellation program, leaving no good plan in place for deep space exploration. The only part of the Constellation program that survived was the Orion capsule. So, now with the Constellation program canceled, it was time for a new launch vehicle, and the Senate told NASA that they wanted a rocket with the ability for the first version to put 70 to 100 tons into low Earth orbit, the ability for an upper stage to put at least 130 tons into low Earth orbit, the ability to launch the Orion capsule, the ability to back up the ISS with crew and cargo, it has to be shuttle-derived, and, quote, has the capacity for efficient and timely evolution. So, after a year of designing, SLS was born. Instead of going straight into building SLS, NASA started with building multiple test articles to verify the structure and strength of the design. In this mission, they basically built the entire core stage along with the ICPS and the Orion adapter. Then, something terrible happened. After completing the test article and the liquid hydrogen tank for the first SLS mission, they found out that the welding pin had a problem that could affect the pressurization, causing them to have to put the LH2 tank into storage, which was later fixed and is now slated for Artemis 3. But at the time, they had to start all over on a new tank, pushing the launch date to 2019. Oh, but wait, there's more. Mother Nature, wanting to add some chaos into the program, dropped an EF-3 tornado on the plant where the fuel tanks were being manufactured. The personnel were all safe, barring some minor injuries, but obviously you can't work on a rocket when the building is being repaired, so progress was put on hold. Then, 3 months later, the liquid oxygen aft dome was literally dropped and was deemed unusable, causing an even longer delay, pushing the launch date to 2020. Then, in 2019 to 2020, the core stage was completed and brought to the Stennis Space Center for testing. Things were looking good, and SLS was scheduled to launch in 2020.
I have today declared that the coronavirus presents a public health emergency in the United States. The actions we have taken and continue to take.
This delayed the 6-month testing run by a year due to shutdowns and other pandemic effects, which basically slowed processing and testing to a crawl. But then on January 6, 2021, the final core stage test was upon us. It was to simulate the launch from ignition to engine cutoff, and unfortunately shut down 67.7 seconds in. A problem with the engine vectoring mechanism and hydraulics caused the shutdown, and the test was now incomplete. Now, the second test was scheduled for March 18th, and this test actually went quite well. The engines did not shut down early, and NASA was able to get all the data they needed to verify the vehicle for flight. SLS was now out of the testing phase, and now on to construction. After arriving at the Cape, NASA began the process of refurbishing the core stage and stacking the vehicle. Stacking was soon complete, and SLS was rolled out for wet dress rehearsal. The first round of tests failed, causing the vehicle to have to be rolled back into the VAB. The second round of tests thankfully succeeded, and Artemis was on schedule to launch in November of 2022.
7, 6, 5. Four-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
And Artemis 1 lifted off with a near-flawless mission on November 16th, 2022. But the previous series of unfortunate events led to much disappointment in the spaceflight community. And even though NASA had made great progress with proportionally less funding than previous programs, many felt that the dates that were set were supposed to be set in stone. A promise, if you will. So, when many of the members of the spaceflight community saw these promises being broken and broken over and over again, they began to feel discontent. And their impatience grew and grew, and eventually started to boil over. While this was all going down, another program was working in tandem to rebuild the US's capacity to put crew in space after the shuttle's retirement. After the shuttle was canceled, the US had to pay Russia to send astronauts to the ISS on the Soyuz launch vehicle. Now, Soyuz is one of the most important launch vehicles in human history, launching over 1,700 times since 1968, and has an incredible safety record since 1971 at least. But even though this is an amazing rocket, in my opinion, the US understandably didn't want to be dependent on the Russian Federation for launching astronauts. So they tried to get rid of that dependency by outsourcing their responsibilities to private companies. So, the first of the contracts are handed out to a few companies, including Sierra Nevada for their Dream Chaser spaceplane, Boeing for Starliner, and SpaceX for Crew Dragon. Dream Chaser lost funding in 2014, but its development was continued throughout the decade, and we'll see what happens with that. SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft was the first to reach the ISS, while Boeing's Starliner had software problems the first flight and was able to dock with the ISS on May 2022, which was followed by its most recent embarrassing flight and the whole fiasco that surrounded that. The US has now stopped flying astronauts on Soyuz, which, considering the current circumstances with Ukraine, was probably for the best. The main thing to note here was SpaceX's amazing success with reusable rockets and a high launch cadence, creating a functional, partially reusable launch system in less than a decade. Now, since we know what's been going on with the spaceflight industry, let's check up on the spaceflight community. After the shuttle program got started, there were spaceflight fans who wanted us to go back to deep space exploration. This group of fans started to gain steam a bit after the Challenger disaster in the mid-1980s. The shuttle felt like a step backwards and a monument to stagnation. So soon they turned their eyes to the red planet, Mars. There were plenty of technical concepts to fuel the imagination, and the red planet seemed like the right step. Mars at first glance seems like a good place for colonization, and a decently sized selection of the space exploration community agreed. But that led to something very unfortunate to arise. A small section of the spaceflight community became obsessed with that goal, fueled in part by certain figures. They didn't really care about safety, costs, or the engineering behind it. All that mattered was getting there. This is cataloged beautifully in an article written by Jeffrey Bell in Space Daily 19 years ago. When I visit the websites of the various space advocacy groups, they are a pale shadow of the L5 Society and the Space Studies Institute. Many of these organizations seem to live in a dream palace of their own creation, which has no relationship to the real world at all. Today's space settlement advocates have drifted back to the 1950s vision of living on the surfaces of planets. Superficially, it looks easier. The initial capital investment can be much less. There's no need to lift massive amounts of material out of a gravity well. Unfortunately, the new generation of organizations like the Space Frontier Foundation and the Mars Society, and even the STED National Space Society, mostly lack something that the old L5 Society and Space Studies Institute had: technical sophistication. Now, further in the article, he discusses some major potential problems with Mars colonization, including thermal, radiation, and gravity concerns. But since I don't want to just steal his entire article, I will skip to the end where he talks about how the debilitating effects of low gravity are ignored by many of these enthusiasts. Another thing you'll never see from the Mars Society is a realistic discussion of what would happen to the human body in the low Martian gravity. Zubrin has discussed at length the need for artificial spin gravity on the 6-month trip to Mars, but he assumes that the problem ends once the astronauts land on Mars. The problem of bone loss in a 0.38 G field on Mars for 18 months is completely ignored. When I read Zubrin's book, The Case for Mars, I was so intrigued by this surprising omission that I consulted a friend who is a space medic at JSC. He tells me that this issue was once discussed at a conference of medical doctors who had actually worked with the long-term residents of Mir and ISS. None of these experts thought that humans could adapt permanently to Mars gravities. Why don't the Zubrinists discuss these issues? They will have to be solved before anyone lives permanently on Mars. It's not too early to think about them. But at the Mars Society website, you don't find any study groups of scientists and engineers and grad students actually working out the technology we'll need to colonize Mars. Instead, you will find a Mars colonization song exists. So, this group throughout the early 2000s seemed mostly harmless, but when Constellation was defunded, I could imagine many were disappointed and angry. To them, it had seemed that the government had failed at the task again, so they started looking elsewhere for a hope. Elsewhere for Mars colonization. And they found one specific individual, one man, who promised to make their dreams come true. Elon Musk for years has branded himself as the billionaire-eccentric innovator who is pioneering new technologies and is bringing us into the future. And he's been quite successful with this endeavor. While most of the ultra-wealthy in the US have a somewhat negative opinion around them, if they're not just hated or mocked, I mean, look at the public perception of Mark Zuckerberg. He is, if you'd believe the internet, an artificial intelligence. Or look at Jeff Bezos. He and his company Amazon are perceived terribly. So why does Musk enjoy a PR status on par with Edison or Ford? Well, it's quite simple. Elon Musk has used branding and PR tactics in an incredibly effective way. In the public eye, the super wealthy are often seen as greedy, unhappy businessmen that are completely out of touch with the general public, to which they also usually despise. Or as out-of-touch sadistic playboys. Elon Musk was able to fix this perception by doing two things. Elon Musk undermined the first issue by saying that he single-handedly pioneered multiple companies, mainly PayPal, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and The Boring Company. He also claims he works 80 to 90 hours a week. This serves to make it seem that he is not a lazy fat cat who just sits around raking in money. Now, that's not to say he does not work hard. To get that amount of money, you have to put in effort. But we're talking about his PR strategy here, not unverifiable personal claims. The second thing he did was to make himself look cool and not miserly. This was done by his escapades in interviews and shenanigans on Twitter. Smoking pot while posting memes served to make him more relatable and on the level. This has worked amazingly, especially to the younger generations on the internet, praising him as a breath of fresh air in comparison to the other super wealthy in America. So, with Elon Musk having a good reputation in the public eye as a successful and charismatic billionaire innovator, many people began looking up to him, seeing him as someone they aspired to be, someone who is rich, successful, or, more importantly, seeing him as somebody who is trying to save the world with his innovative technology. He provides hope to those concerned about the future. An easy way out, if you will. There is a cult of personality here. Now, I'm not saying everyone who is a fan of Musk is a cultist. Let me repeat. Not everyone who is a fan of Musk is a cultist, but online there's a sizable chunk of people who follow him like a god, with this almost pseudo-technical religion around it. And I do mean pseudo-religion. Think about it, a common set of beliefs with deep emotional significance that brings meaning to its believers. Now, I don't think this is Elon Musk's fault entirely. I don't think he ever intended for this to happen. I think it was more he was in the right place at the right time for this critical mass to pop off. So for the spaceflight community, the successes of SpaceX served to create a belief that if NASA was going to take longer than they wanted to get a man to Mars, then they should support Musk instead. And this group of followers became incredibly toxic. I have spoken to multiple engineers who have told me either they or their colleagues have deleted their social media accounts because of the unstoppable tsunami of negative posts and harassment from mostly SpaceX fans. Now, as I mentioned previously, I am not saying that all SpaceX fans are toxic. That would be an absurd and wrong claim. But it is impossible to ignore the sizable minority that is. If we have a spectrum from NASA's cool to SpaceX's cool, this is our distribution. The area to the right has more techie types and young people, and the area to the left has more people who actually work in the spaceflight industry. Now, if you sit in this circle right here, you may prefer one or the other, but you are generally fairly well composed about your beliefs. You don't get too brash or emotional. But, if we zoom out, we see there has grown a bit of a group over here. One that spouts glory to Musk and frowns on any independent thought on space policy that does not align with Elon Musk should do everything. So, to recap all of this, We have NASA taking longer than expected to get SLS moving, a Mars-obsessed part of the spaceflight community that does not care about specific technical details and is impatient to get there, along with a charismatic billionaire whose aerospace company SpaceX has had great success in the past 10 years and promises that he can give this community everything it wants. Everything fell into perfect place. This is the state of the spaceflight community right now. And it's not just quite the shame, it could also cause serious problems down the road, but we'll hit on that point later. Now, it's time for the fun part. Now here's the thing, it's very easy to sit outside of a debate doing meta-analysis and just explaining what's going on. But what's the point of all of that if you're not going to get your hands a bit dirty? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break down the main argument from this group and then do a little of that forbidden thing we call disagreeing. If we boil the beliefs of this group down into an argument form, this is what we get. Now here I have that written as a logical equation, but in plain English what it means is we should have either SLS and NASA or SpaceX and Starship. Because SLS and NASA are bad/inefficient/other, and Starship and SpaceX are better, we should follow SpaceX and Starship. Now, technically this is a logical argument form, as it is a disjunctive syllogism, but it is a fallacy, because the issue is not with the logic, but with the premise itself. The axioms that have been chosen here are wrong. In reality, there is no PVQ relationship. There is no either-or between government or private space, and the opinion that there is based on the general idea that Starship good, Orange Rocket bad. So here's what I'll do. We will go over why SpaceX is not the saint that you'd expect it to be from Redditors online, and then go over why SLS and NASA are not terrible things. Let's do this. So, your boy DSD has done his first journalism. I have decided to do an interview with someone inside the space industry who has worked with both NASA and SpaceX. Now, this interview will be anonymous. This is to make sure that there is no retaliation against this individual for their statements, because yes, that is actually something we have to be concerned about, with losers online who have nothing better to do than harass people who disagree with them. Actually, I don't know why I'm surprised with that. Anyway, on to the interview. What are your thoughts on SpaceX and its effects in the industry? They're a pain in the ass to work with because of how strict their NDA is, plus because of a lot of elitism/cockiness in some of their workforce, and seem pretty bad/amateur at doing analysis, which I suppose makes sense because their company is built on trying to use non-standard aerospace hardware and certifying it through testing rather than analysis. And something that frustrates me a lot is that they explicitly hide issues/failures/anomalies through their NDA, so that the only stuff that makes it to the public eye are the things that can't be hidden, like something physically exploding and being caught on camera. I've had multiple coworkers even tell me that they feel like it's not a matter of if, but when crew members or workers get seriously injured or killed because of the kind of corners that can get cut by that methodology of certifying through test rather than analysis. One of my coworkers even pointed out to me how it feels like a step backwards, like SpaceX went back to the 50s era of engineering of building a bunch of prototypes to see what works, whereas the rest of the industry modernized to use engineering analysis to prove that components will work. What do older engineers on the program think about what seems to be the unprofessionalism of SpaceX as a contractor? The ones who know about it definitely don't like it. One coworker in my branch used to work commercial crew and spoke to me privately about how he's worried that their company culture and the kinds of dangers that might come out of HLS, based on the kind of stuff he's seen them get away with on the commercial crew program. Another coworker in my branch was mocking how he overheard a SpaceX engineer on a phone call bragging about how they're smarter and better than NASA because of some Monte Carlo analysis the SpaceX engineer was running. Though, of course, my coworker was making fun of how the parameters the engineer said he was using were garbage. Heck, even when I was an intern going on tours of the various labs around MSFC, a few of the folks who presented to us made some jabs at SpaceX. One that stuck out was a guy who worked on Fast Track, who seemed salty about the design being given over to SpaceX, who subsequently took all the credit. And this is an important detail. Many people like to imagine SpaceX as being some self-funded company beating NASA at their own game. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. SpaceX has received over $20 billion from the US government, and the sharing of a huge amount of technical information. In short, they would not exist without NASA. But back to the interview. Are any of these issues present with other contractors like Lockheed Martin or ULA? They definitely don't operate in the same way. And speaking of other launch providers, let's talk about a Reddit post made by the CEO of United Launch Alliance, Tory Bruno, on the topic of why the industry switched to analysis instead of testing. The industry deliberately switched. There were a couple reasons why. It's a much lower long-term risk approach when you rely more heavily on flight testing. You are at the mercy of only being able to test for the specific condition of those flights and the variability you happen to get on that set of hardware. As your future plays out over time, you encounter other flight conditions and variations in the hardware that were not present in your early flights. These can, and have, led to flight failures down the road, just when you were settling into a false sense of security. The customer environment grew far less tolerant of flight failures. Back in the 1960s and 70s, the vast majority of rockets were military. These were developed in a big hurry, under crisis conditions, in an environment where large sophisticated test facilities literally did not exist, and a lot of time would have been required to build them. Consequently, there was a large tolerance for the build, fly, break, fix, try again approach to development. The Polaris missile, for example, failed 13 consecutive flights until the 14th had a partial success, which meant that it flew beyond visual range before blowing up. By 1980, that kind of experience was not tolerated. A development program would be canceled long before it got to that point. There's a debate in the community as whether or not the old way is faster. It is in my experience that it is absolutely slower and more costly, unless it is also accompanied by an absence of rigid requirements. If you are willing to be completely flexible and to toss aside any single requirement or capability that proves too initially challenging, the old way is the fastest way to get something flying. This approach means that you initially get something flying that isn't everything you really need, but has some utility, even if that utility is only creating enough investor confidence to keep going. Then you incrementally improve it over time. In the long run, this will be slower and more costly to the ultimate, much later, finish line, but is far and away to the first flight, first to investment, and sometimes first to market. And then later stating, yes, SpaceX has shown a mastery of being first to market, often doing so by skipping over difficult and important capabilities and returning to them later or eventually. Now this is a lot of information, but all I need you to take home is two things. First, certifying vehicles by testing and not analysis, while quicker, is costlier in the long run. And secondly, the very nature of certifying vehicles in this way is limited and can create a false sense of security that can lead to disasters down the road. But now that we've gone over some of the more abstract issues at SpaceX, let's quickly go through some points about Starship. Oh boy, am I poking the bear with this one. A system that is supposed to land on the moon that requires 16 launches to get there and back with barely enough Delta V to spare. 16 launches. The Apollo program had 13 Saturn V launches. The entire program. A system whose current actual financial purpose is to flood the night sky with thousands upon thousands of satellites. Along with ruining amateur astronomy, these satellites disrupt important applications like astronomy-related sciences and asteroid detection. And before you say that space telescopes have made ground scopes obsolete, well, the James Webb and Hubble Space Telescopes sit around an angular resolution of 0.07 and 0.05 arcseconds respectively, while the ground-based European Very Large Telescope has an angular resolution of 0.002 arcseconds, which is 25 times higher. Now, in all fairness, SpaceX is not the only one doing these satellite constellations. Hell, there are groups that are far worse, but they are still throwing gasoline onto this candle. Moving on, a system that has no launch escape system, 30 some odd engines in the first stage, and requires a suicide burn for landing. I don't care how safe you claim it will be. Without that first component, you're playing with fire, and before they say it, because I can just feel the keyboard warriors furiously typing in the comments section below, that safe as an airline claim is garbage. There is simply not enough data for SpaceX to even speculate on that. Hell, the only reason you can make that trash equivocation is because airlines have flown collectively over 1 billion times, and we can do the math. SpaceX and Elon Musk want to claim that this will be as safe as an airline. And that is a safety factor of around 1 to 1.6 million. And to get an inferential statistic like that, you're going to need a lot more than 6 launches, more like 6,000. But from the 6 flights we have seen, we have not seen that reliability. Instead, we have seen anomaly after anomaly. Things like this would be unacceptable in the general or commercial aviation setting. If I am flying my 152 and my aileron is falling off, that is not the time for me to say, hey, it's okay, I still have rudder. Also, at least for the current century, Starship or any launch vehicle will never be as safe as any aircraft. Why? Well, I could go on and explain in great detail the difference in operations between an aircraft and a super heavy lift launch vehicle. But I think it'd be a bit more entertaining to explore one possible failure scenario. The following is exactly what is supposed to happen with an engine failure in an aircraft. Okay, we have an engine out. Let's establish a glide slope. Okay, we should be able to land in that field down there. Townsville traffic, mayday, 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 Cessna 05 Papa Alpha, 12 miles northwest, engine failure, Townsville traffic. Okay, let's see if we can get that engine back on. Nope. Well, I guess we're going to have to land in that field. Compare that with Starship's engine out procedure. Plus, the similar excuse of, it will be safe enough that it won't need extra redundancy, is ridiculous. We have not seen any system that takes people above 60,000 feet that does not need that redundancy, be that balloon, aircraft, or rocket. And before you mention the shuttle, yes, it needed that redundancy. Hell, to go on a bit of a tangent, SpaceX has really got behind and promoted the phrase rapid unscheduled disassembly. Ironically, of course, but it still serves to distract from the situation and move the person's mind away from the seriousness of the situation to the ironic enjoyment of, ooh, explosion cool / funny. And on that topic, I do enjoy a good explosion. Everyone does. Fluid and plasma dynamics are very beautiful and can be awesome. But that being said, we are not the military. Our job is not to blow up the target. Our job is to get to the target without blowing up. And yes, it's all fun and games until that pretty explosion is not an uncrewed vessel, but one that contains people. To which I would doubt in the ensuing press conference that SpaceX management would have the balls to say, our spacecraft went through a rapid unscheduled disassembly. No, because engineering is not all fun and games. Sure, you need to have fun, but you can't let that distract you from having an attitude of responsibility, maturity, and seriousness about the situation. Am I being a prude? Probably. But this is only a symptom of this attitude. An attitude that will lead to disaster. Oh, and if you don't believe me, we're already seeing SpaceX ignore warning signs and even direct failures in their components. And here's the thing. That didn't work out for NASA, it didn't work out for the USSR, and it's not going to work out for SpaceX. The fact that people were calling the first launch a successful test when it exploded is absurd. Unless you planned for it to explode in the upper atmosphere, it was a failure. The Navy did not call Kaputnik a success. The Soviets did not call any of the 4 launches of the N-1 a success. This is not a success. We are seeing in real time the normalization of deviance. We got the engines getting a really good annealing on landing, engines failing, tiles falling off, the joints of control surfaces literally getting atomized on re-entry. But no, these things are not seen as major design flaws, but as a feature. Fans will say, no, you're looking at it wrong. That just demonstrates how the system can handle issues. But if these issues happen every flight, it's not an abnormality. It's the norm. You are literally just doing a normalization of deviance, and you may get lucky with the first 5 flights, the first 10 flights, hell, maybe even the first 20 flights. But just as with the shuttle, something will break. Now, since we've looked at SpaceX, let's respond to the more common points some of the more extreme elements of the SpaceX fandom will make. SpaceX is being disruptive against the expensive and overpriced SLS. Okay, let's look into that. While many people compare the cost of launching on SLS and the cost of launching on Starship, they usually see the number $1 billion per launch for SLS versus $2 million per launch for Starship. First, these numbers are not accurate. Like I mentioned earlier, the cost for Starship is most likely vastly underestimated. Remember, the space shuttle was originally supposed to launch payload for $180 a pound, and that ended up being $50,000 per pound. Plus, $2 million is considered a fever dream by most people with a bit of engineering or program knowledge. It's like saying you can get a plane ticket on an intercontinental flight down to $10. Absolutely ridiculous. Which is why it's been backtracked to $100 million a launch, which is still a lowball. Secondly, because government programs are mostly underfunded, they can end up putting costs that are not closely related to the actual programs in the program. What do I mean by this? Well, there's a great interview from Wayne Hill talking about how program costs are calculated. Here's a quote from his blog. Each NASA center had a tax on every program inside their gate. That is to say, if a program used a center, then the program contributed to the upkeep of the center. Paying the guards at the front gate, mowing the grass, paying the light bill, seem fair? Well, if the shuttle program was the only program at a center, as it was for several of the largest NASA centers for a long time, the tax was eye-wateringly high. Does the VAB need a new coat of paint? The shuttle program gets to pay for that. Does the MCC need a new roof? The shuttle program gets to pay for that. Does the A2 test stand need a new flame bucket? The shuttle program gets to pay for that. If the shuttle program goes away, does the VAB still need paint? And the MCC still need a roof? Yes. When one calculates the cost of ferrying the shuttle from California to Florida, it makes sense to include the cost of fuel used, and one should probably include some allowance for the maintenance on the 747. But do you include an amount for the amortization of capital expense of actually buying the plane in the first place? And the cost of modifications made to change it from a passenger plane into a shuttle ferry? A one-time expense paid years ago? But even with all of that, SLS has cost $26.4 billion over 13 years, which is around $2 billion per year, while SpaceX Starship has the cost of who knows. Yeah, I'm not actually joking. SpaceX has kept the program cost as a closely guarded secret. Very transparent of them. On a side note, this is another thing that helps SpaceX. See, NASA has to release their budget because they are accountable to the people. SpaceX as a private company can choose to release whatever they want. But when you're spending that amount of money, it's really not that hard to come up with a good idea for the total cost by using secondary information, which myself and many people have found to indicate a program cost between $14 and $19 billion over 5 years, which if we lowball it at $14 billion gives us a cost of $2.8 billion a year. Wasn't SLS poorly run? Kind of. NASA was getting a bit too generous with contracts and overruns for a while, and this was absolutely an issue. And myself and most people were not a fan of Boeing's incompetence as well. Plus, there were some more issues with NASA I'll talk about in a little bit. But wait, DST, isn't SLS a jobs program? No. There is no reason to look at SLS and say that it's terrible because it was built in New Orleans, Huntsville, etc. The places where we have been building stuff like this for over 60 years. Or that it's being launched in Florida, the place where all of the existing facilities already exist. What all of this is complaining that we're building rockets in the locations we have built all of this stuff for the last 60 years. What matters are the capabilities, and with SLS, those are pretty good. Using smaller launchers like Falcon Heavy to assemble a vehicle to get us to the moon would be cheaper. You don't see this particular argument used a lot anymore since Starship launched, but in-Earth assembly is something I'm generally fine with as an idea. I do think we should do something akin to that for Mars missions. But as for getting somebody to the moon, Von Braun actually wanted to do the same thing with the Saturn I, using it to assemble a vehicle in low Earth orbit, but he and his engineers decided against that in favor of building a super heavy lift launch vehicle, the Saturn V. SLS is not reusable, so isn't it bad? Reusability is an important factor to consider when designing a launch vehicle, but there is a trade-off. If you have a lot of launches, it makes sense to have a reusable vehicle. How many is a lot? Well, around 2-digit launches per year. So something like Falcon 9 makes a lot of sense for it to be reusable. But if you're launching less than that, it's a lot easier to just not make it overly complex and go with a disposable or partially disposable system. Materials are not the most expensive part of spaceflight. People are. But doesn't SLS use old tech? The fact that a design is old has no bearing on its usefulness. Take the RL-10. It was designed by Pratt & Whitney in the 1950s. It is to this day the most efficient liquid chemical rocket engine ever made, excluding systems that use unorthodox and incredibly dangerous tripropellant mixtures with fluorine, ion engines that produce a sheet of paper's worth of thrust, or to go nuclear. I actually like the last one, but unfortunately Nerva got canceled 50 years ago, so currently we're SOL. And the other concepts that are floating around really haven't been funded at all. But anyway, guess where the RL-10 is being used today? Yep. As the Navy propellant engineer John D. Clark said in 1972, there appears to be little left to do in liquid propellant chemistry, and very few important developments to be anticipated. In short, we propellant chemists have worked ourselves out of a job. Or maybe they're talking about the RS-25. Sure, I would have preferred another engine be used. We all would. But letting them sit around is not a productive use for them. And with the limited money provided by the government, NASA had to use what they had. Or are they talking about SRBs? SRBs as a concept are not really old tech. You can make them as complicated as you want. They're just a tool you can use to get a lot of thrust relatively easily. Or is it the vehicle structure itself? SLS uses a pretty standard design using an aluminum structure for the core stage, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense since it's like saying the F-35 would be old because it uses a fuselage. What matters is not how old the tech is. What matters is can it do what you need it to do, and this so-called old tech is some of the best ever built. But DST, Starship can do stuff SLS can't do. Yes, mainly two things. First, orbital refueling. Now, assuming they can get that working, yes, Starship is pretty much the ideal vehicle to do that, besides this thing. And secondly, Starship has a higher launch cadence. SLS can launch a current max of 3 per year if funded a bit more, while SpaceX can probably push it to around at least 8 per year. But in regards to most other things, SLS does it better. Less failure points, larger payload to geostationary orbit or TLI, larger payload volume on Block 1B, and a launch escape system, and is just generally a much more sound vehicle from a safety, design, and reliability standpoint. And this is where SLS really shines, as a crew vehicle that can carry a good chunk of payload or shoot vehicles out into deep space, while Starship would be more effective at transporting large amounts of fuel and payload into low Earth orbit. Wait a second. It's almost like these two could work together. Now, it may sound like I'm some dude who thinks everything NASA has ever done is great. Hell no. There have been a lot of issues with the organization. The really big problem, though, is with excessive bureaucracy. I have had the privilege to have spoken with many former NASA scientists and engineers. These are people who knew von Braun, who knew James Webb, who helped build the facilities that are being used now. And from nearly all of them, I have heard the same thing. It used to be that NASA was run by engineers and scientists. Now, it's run by lawyers and managers. Lawyers and managers who do not have a passion for the program, and even worse, have never had any experience in engineering or manufacturing. Now, that's not to say, if you're a manager, or if you're a business person, or if you're a lawyer, that you can't run a program. You absolutely can, and you can do it well. But that being said, managers, business people, lawyers, they're not engineers, they're not scientists, and unfortunately, that leaves something out. Now that we've gone over some points about NASA, I think it's important to examine how they do business. It used to be that NASA would design a system, contract out to companies to build components, work very close with those companies and make sure they would all play nice with each other, and you'd come out with a decent vehicle. But unfortunately, in the pursuit of lower costs, a much worse system was implemented. Let's use HLS as an example. NASA says they want to do something. Companies give their own proposals on how they think it should be done, and NASA is forced to pick one even if none of them are ideal. This is crazy. Let's say you want to commission a painting. A portrait of you and your dog, perhaps. You find the best impressionist painters you can find. But when you ask the first guy, he says that no, he thinks it would be better if it was you and a moose. And you can't pick one of the other artists because the second guy is charging a lot more, but in all fairness, he will paint you what you ask. And the third guy is charging even more, but you soon find out that he can't even paint at all. Oh, and just to be cheeky, it turns out the first guy who gave you the cheap quote was lying the whole time and has no idea how to paint the moose that he pushed for. This is the biggest threat to a unified space program right now. This fighting between organizations and contractors did not work out for the Soviets and their design bureaus, and it will not work out for us. This idea that our current space program is somehow nationalized under NASA and the US government and needs to be privatized to increase efficiency is ridiculous. Our space program has been a majority privatized since the 1960s. If you want to say that the programs could be run better, absolutely, I agree, they could be run better, but burning down the entire structure is a moronic way to get there. I believe in the idea that sometimes the government can create specialized programs and departments to do more niche tasks to benefit the entire country, in partnership with private industry. Departments like the Armed Forces, NOAA, EPA, NRC, etc. Are all of these programs perfect? Hell no, but they are a net positive. No one likes extreme authoritarian government control like communism, or the chaos that comes with anarcho-capitalism. Let's instead take the best of both worlds, and this was a pretty recognized concept in American politics until about 5 minutes ago. We have been slow to get to Mars, and we should have never left the moon. Our space program has not been perfect, but throwing it all away and relying solely on this is ridiculous. If we want the capability for the United States of America to have a space industry that is not disjointed, then we need a well-funded space program. A space program that is more than just administrative. A space program that designs, develops, and builds both in-house and outside of it. NASA versus private industry thinking is childish and ignores the fact that the private space industry would not exist without the research and or support of NASA. All of it. If companies want to try out crazy ideas and get them working, let them do it. America is the nation of freedom, and as long as you're not doing ridiculously immoral things, you should be allowed to try it out. This is a nation that lets you say whatever you want about politicians without fear of retaliation. Most of the world, hell, most of the Western world doesn't give you those freedoms. This is the nation that lets you own and use firearms written into our Constitution. This is the nation where you can start out from the ground with nothing and build an empire through sheer grit and determination. If Elon Musk wants to build the largest rocket ever made, let him. Hell, I applaud it. But emotional attachment to projects like these is a dangerous game. Projecting hopes and dreams onto specific systems and people only leads to disappointment and is not how good engineering is done. Good engineering is about looking at the systems objectively. We all want to go to the stars. I think that is one of the greatest things we as a people can strive for, but moronic infighting will not get us anywhere. I think Mike Griffin said it pretty well.
The first of those is the, in my view, regrettable square wave flip from it's all government all the time in space to if it isn't commercial, why are we bothering to do it? Those are the, I grew up in the all government all the time space world, both civil and national security. And now you basically, as a government employee, have to prove that you can't possibly do what you want commercially before you're allowed to do anything in the government. Both those extremes are wrong. When I was running NASA, I instituted the COTS, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program, because I thought that at that time industry was ready, without assistance from the government, to develop space transportation capable of putting 10 or so metric tons of cargo in orbit, and that the government didn't need to be doing that anymore. I was right. I thought at the time that that industry was not ready to put humans in space, despite how much they were claiming that they were ready to do it. And I used to make the joke that before I'm going to authorize a commercial humans in space program, I want to see them carry the laundry that the crew would wear. Again, I think I was right. The leading contender, SpaceX, was years late getting to orbit. Boeing hasn't made it yet. They weren't ready. And as a consequence, the United States space program was not ready. I also argue that the definition of commercial has been perverted by people for their own self-interest. Commercial means I have an idea that's better than your idea. I go out, I seek investment to support realizing that idea. I gather up that money. I search for customers. I try to get customers to pay me something up front, to help me over the hump. Like when you buy a house, the contractor doesn't build the whole house for you and then you pay at the end. So, I'm okay with the customers providing some money as you go along. But it's what we call an arm's length transaction. If it's commercial, I'm not telling you how to build the house. I hired you because I thought you knew, but I'm not telling you how to build it. That's exactly the opposite of government responsibility. The Navy isn't asking shipbuilders how to design the Columbia-class submarine. The Navy's designing the Columbia-class submarine, and they should. So until we can return to the proper definition of commercial, we're going to be kidding ourselves. What we have today are people who say we want to do commercial space. What they really mean is, I want the government to hand me a bunch of money to do something that we actually need done, but I don't want to have to follow the rules of the big five prime contractors because, that makes me slow and stupid. Well, I agree, nobody should have to follow all those rules. Government has become bloated and just wrong, but we need to change the rules for everybody. The rules don't just get changed because you're not one of the big five prime contractors and you would like to do commercial space. It's only commercial if you raised all the money yourself, brought the product to the market, and then sold it for all the traffic would bear. That's commercial.
If America wants to get back to the moon, we will need to work together, private industry and public programs. Because guess what? SpaceX ain't getting us to the moon by themselves. NASA needs to have enough funding and a damn good plan. Because when the American people are paying for that rocket, and they have elected representatives to decide what is the best option, as is the way in a republic, you can't just throw it all away to somebody who is not concerned with what America needs, but with what he thinks we need. But at the same time, we should still cooperate and support private interests. In the end, this is the question. What kind of space program do we want to look back on? One where we made the same mistakes of the Soviet Union in the 60s, constantly preoccupied with infighting and irrational grudges? Or one where NASA, SpaceX, Lockheed, Northrop, Blue Origin, Boeing, L3, General Dynamics, and every other spaceflight organization comes together? SLS and Starship can work together to bring America back to the moon and beyond. And if we don't, well, somebody else is going to get there first. It's easy to get preoccupied with insignificant things. Our battle is not with each other, and I know that's a cliche thing to say, but that's because it's true. And over the last 20 years, in our desperation to see the dream of deep space exploration come true, we have all chosen petty squabbling instead of what's important. We've all forgotten about what spaceflight is actually about. Hi there, thanks for watching. I'd like to quickly thank everyone who helped me make this video. It's been a really long 3 years, and just thank you to my friends outside and inside of the industry. Besides that, that's all I got. Thank you for watching, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.